inside hole 2. 5 million bit of it.
I shouldn't have emotions.
Along with a Dalek.
I need to say nucleus next time.
A man in a very giant costume. Right. I'm off to find Jess. I found Jess. She is hard at work explaining things.
Hello and welcome to Maths on the Move, the podcast from plus.maths.org. I'm Marianne Freiberger. The voice you just heard at the start of this podcast was my colleague Rachel Thomas at the very busy and noisy UK Games Expo, which happened in Birmingham earlier this summer. Rachel was catching up with our friend Jess Enright of the University of Glasgow, who is also part of the Juniper network of disease modelers. And Jess is experimenting with some very surprising and fun ways to talk about mathematical models. And mathematical models, of course, are very important in the modeling of infectious diseases, as well as in many, many, many other applications of mathematics. So let's get back to Jess in action at the UK Games Expo.
So the way the turnover I'm Jess Enright. I work at the University of Glasgow in the School of Computing Science. So I like to make games about my research and research games, and I bring those to UK Games Expo to communicate them with the gaming public.
So tell me in a nutshell what your research is so we know why games is appropriate.
Sure. I do kind of two types of research. So I do some research that people would basically consider pure maths, and I use games to try and communicate aspects of that. I've got one game here today about that. The other thing that I do is modeling, mainly for infectious diseases. And so I have games that either capture the findings of research projects, or I have games that try and communicate what models are like and what the world inside models is like. So we have this project ending this summer on graphs, like you say, which are just a maths word for networks, basically dots and lines. And we were looking at structures that are what we call multi-layered, which means that there's something different about the lines. So the example we usually talk about are something like, imagine that you have dots and they're people and you have different kinds of contacts. So like I'm talking to you face to face, right? But I have other contacts that are only online, and those are sort of importantly different for things like disease control, right?
Those lines would be different in that network of connections.
Yeah, different in that network, yes. So we studied a game that's called Cops and Robbers, which has cops pursuing robbers around a network, and we looked at a version of it where some of the little roads can only be used by robbers and some only by cops. So we've made a game, we called it Ghosts and Ghost Hunters to make it just a little more fun, and a friend of mine helped me out with the graphic design to try and let people play that game. And we're doing a little pilot project surveying whether having played the game helps people understand the game more than just reading about the game. So I'm really excited about that one. That's a new one. I think we finished it up this past week. So as always, kind of sliding it in there just in time for Expo.
And again, I've seen people playing this, and so some people played, they enjoyed it so much they then asked to play it again between themselves at another table. So that's great. And finally, the reason we started talking about this in recent past was because of this idea of adventures in Model Land. What on earth is Model Land, and what am I doing having adventures?
Yeah, so I think Model Land was originally inspired by this book by Erica Thompson about escape from Model Land. And I think part of the idea here is that it's really, like, I write models, and nevertheless, when I think about someone else's model, in my imagination, they are like perfect physical simulations of the world. Like there are tiny simulated humans running around coughing on each other, or there are like tiny water droplets falling in a perfect simulation of the landscape. And like, I'm pretty knowledgeable about models, and I still think that, and that is absolutely not true, right? Like, models are these abstracted worlds, and that's not a bad thing. We need them to be that in order to do with them what we need to do. It's not really a limitation, though of course it can be. So the idea of adventures in Model Land is to take kind of the uncanny parts of what a world would be like inside a model, the limitations, and make it a fun communication tool instead of something that's a limitation. So Adventures in Model Land is this framework that a number of academics came up with. It's online for free if anybody wants to see it, that help you as a modeler write a description of what the world inside your model would be like if sort of like Tron, you were like transported inside the model, what it would be like as a human, to help you understand that it wouldn't be like the real world. It would be crazy and weird. And that helps people, I think, understand what modeling does and what it can do. So this is a brand new project for us. So I've been working with a student intern, Emma. She's folded up a whole load of these tiny zines.
They're excellent. They're so cool.
Yeah, I'm so impressed with her. That have little excerpts from some of the model land descriptions and a QR code where we're going to hopefully post a whole bunch more of these in the future to help people understand. I think this is the beginning of like a really valuable tool in public communication about models because it makes it like a little bit fun on something that can be quite heavy.
So what are you hoping that you as a mathematician and people outside of mathematics get from something like this?
So first of all, for both public and us, fun. It should be fun, and that's what I want. It's Games Expo. We're here for fun. For a modeler who's writing this, I think that thinking about your model in this way helps you understand it differently to how you would when you're writing it in Coder Maths. And I think that's always useful, right? For a member of the public, I think that it should help them understand a bit more about what our process is when we create these, but also really getting that this isn't a simulation, it's an abstraction or kind of what it can and can't do, because models of this sort, like think back to COVID, modeling really contributed to a lot of decision making, so it impacted people's lives, right? And so people being able to understand what models can do and what they can't do when they are impacting their own lives, I think is important. Also, I mean, in a sense, it's a bit idealistic, but like all of my research is publicly funded, so communicating about it to the public, or at least the gaming public, is important. I think that's a requirement.
And I can't think of a more fun way to get people involved in math research than having them sit down, talking to each other, battling out over a mathematical model.
Yeah, I think it also, in a funny way, has more of the feeling. So I just came from a mathematics conference in Canada. I'm very jet lagged. I'm very caffeinated.
You're doing very well.
I'm having a great time. But I think that sitting down and playing a game together and battling it out actually is closer to the experience of what doing mathematics is like for a mathematician. Right, that kind of like spark of fun that we sit down and fiddle around with the puzzle and try and figure it out. And you sit down at this game and don't know how to play it at all at first, and then as you're playing it, figure out, oh, actually, I really needed to put a hunter here, or oh, I really needed one more hunter, or something like that.
You totally see when I was watching people play, they're staring at it, and then you can see both of them. They go, oh, and
yeah.
You're right. It is. It's like working collaboratively on a problem together.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, good luck, Jess. I hope you have an excellent day.
Yes.
So the idea of learning about mathematics by playing games sounds amazing. And as you've just heard from Rachel and Jess when they were chatting at the Games Expo, Jess is now doing research about how effective it is using these games to communicate mathematical models and allow people to really engage with these ideas and even give them an experience that gives a flavor of what it's like doing mathematical research. Jess first told us about this earlier this year at the annual Juniper meeting, and we were really, really excited. And even I started to enjoy playing games, which I normally don't, which is quite amazing. After visiting Jess at the Games Expo, Rachel then caught up with her, as well as the two other researchers Jess has mentioned, Erica Thompson and Chris Skinner.
I'm Erica Thompson, and I'm an Associate Professor of Modelling for Decision Making at University College London.
I'm Chris Skinner. I'm an independent geoscientist and researcher and a visiting fellow at York St John University.
I'm Jess Enright. I'm a reader in the School of Computing Science at the University of Glasgow.
Now, so a couple of weeks ago, I was lucky enough to visit Jess at the Games Expo in Birmingham, which was great fun. And as well as getting a sense of the physical games that were related to Jess's mathematical research, we also spoke about this idea of adventures in model land. And Erica, Jess said that the idea of model land came from your book, Escape from Model Land. Can you give us an idea of model land as you discuss it in your book?
So model land for me is where we are when we're kind of inside the model, maybe inside the computer or inside the spreadsheet or inside the system of equations that we wrote down to describe some kind of system. And so that's all very well, but nobody actually cares about what happens inside the model. So the idea of my book is that if we are informing decisions in the real world, then we need to get out of model land by understanding more about what might go wrong with the model, where its biases are, where it might be structurally wrong or just be making some weird assumptions, in order to get ourselves out and transfer those insights about the model back to the real world. And so what I really like about this Adventures in Model Land framework is that we're just kind of taking that and running with it and saying, okay, let's really explore back inside Model Land. What does it look like?
And was there a sort of specific motivation for your book about the idea of recognizing that model land as we experience, as explored with Adventures in Model Land, isn't the same as real world? What was the sort of motivation behind the book?
I mean, the motivation for me, I guess, was working on a series of projects which were all sort of in model land in a sense, but at the end of the day, they were trying to do something that informed the real world. And that was whether it was weather forecasting or energy systems, insurance, disaster risk reduction. People were trying to make real decisions in the real world on the basis of this information that came out of the models. And of course, it would come with caveats and it would come with the assumptions, and people are never quite sure how to interpret those. And I just felt that we needed a more systematic way of thinking about that gap between model land and real world.
And Chris, Jess talked about this idea of adventures in model land that you've all been developing together. I love your description that I read of one of your model lands, the flood world. Can you talk us through how you think modelers like yourself can use this kind of framework of adventures in model land that you've developed?
Yeah, so I think that where the idea of this came from was I was working on a project with on a role play game where they've been pairing up scientists who work in environmental or climate issues with games developers to create role play games around climate with a climate theme. And one of the exercises we were doing at the beginning of our game that we developed was we were designing a city, building a city, imagining where the different bits in the city go and how the connections work, where different workers and people live and work and how the city operates. And it's this whole kind of world building exercise that happens within the role-playing game. I just read Erica's book and absolutely loved it. And this idea of model land to me was just kind of like, oh, hang on, we could pair this idea, this concept of model land with this world building exercise that goes on in role-play games and actually create a world which follows the rules of your model and explore it and see what it's like. And that kind of brings the weirdness, the strangeness of that model land to life, really, through your imagination. I think as a modeler, it's quite useful to kind of just explore that as an individual, to go through your model and think, actually, yeah, this is how my model works. This is where it's not doing things very realistically, or this is where it's making those approximations and exploring it in that way. So that's really useful because it gives you that a more in-depth and imaginative insight into your model. I think the next step of that is then being able to lead others into your model land, almost like a quest, and show people what it's like. So I can imagine, as someone who works in flood risk, finding people who are not modelers, are not technical, but maybe are in a community that's at risk of flooding, and bringing them inside the model and just saying, look, this is the thing that we're using to make decisions about your future, and helping them understand how we rationalize that, how we take into account those differences, and how we make decisions based on those things. So I think on the one hand, it's a really nice, fun activity that you can do just to explore your model land and just see how strange it is and let your imagination go wild. On the other hand, there's potential there for something which I think is a really serious tool for engaging people with those uncertainties and the approximations that models make.
And you've done this exercise of, it's like describing a story of what it feels like to be in one of your particular models there. Is it Caesar Listflood?
It's Caesar Listflood model, yeah.
And when you did that exercise, did it reveal anything new to you? Did it give you any different insights that you maybe hadn't had before?
I think because I kind of think in that way anyway, so I kind of had that picture of the model land in my head, and I think actually we're quite lucky in the type of models that I work with, the kind of the hydraulic models, in that there's already a 2D representation of the world that you're modeling. So it's quite visual anyway. When the model's running, you can see the water flowing through, and we make animations that show the water flowing through that environment.
Suddenly, and after a few minutes had passed, the strength of the rain changed, noticeably getting heavier. The rain had also begun to collect on the ground with pools of blue, emerging out of nothing in depressions. I checked on my watch to time when these changes happened, and it was exactly 5 minutes before the rain changed again, and those pools got deeper, and began to join with those in neighbouring squares. The form of a river began to appear.
I think the fun bit was kind of some of the unusual bits, because Caesar Lisford kind of couples a hydraulic model with a model which represents how landscapes change over time, so how sediment moves and things like that. And there's a threshold in the model for an angle between pixels, and if the angle, the slope angle between those two pixels gets too great, you effectively get a landslide. You get a bunch of material moving from one to the other. When you put in raw observation data, like from a satellite or a LiDAR scan or something, into that model, before the first time step starts, you get this whole series of landslides where all these pixels which are breaching that threshold kind of are found and slumped. So that was quite fun writing that in the story, that you hear all these thunders and clashes around you as all these landslides are happening right at the beginning of the model. And I think that's quite an interesting, that was quite an interesting thing to put in, because it's completely divorced from reality.
At the edges of my square, my current home in this strange land, were small cliffs that were either a climb as beneath me or a drop as before me. The silence was suddenly disturbed by a cascade of echoing crashes. The ground shook as the rumbles of what I assumed was a series of landslides afflicted the landscape simultaneously. Then, as quickly as it started, it was over, and the silence once again dominated the world.
And that really is capturing, embodying kind of this element of the mathematical setup of the model that I definitely wouldn't have thought about before you described it in the narrative.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one to talk to, because it's an arbitrary value. It defaults to 45 degrees, but you can change that to 60. You can change it to 75, and the landscapes that kind of develop as a result of that are different. You change it to a higher number, you'll get steeper slopes. So it's just up to the modeler to pick what number you put in there, and I don't think many people change it from the default. So it's quite interesting to see how that manifests in the model.
And Jess, we met you and first became exposed to the ideas of Model Land through a presentation you gave at the Juniper annual meeting. Does this idea of adventures in Model Land come into play in the way you think about your work with disease modelling that we've heard you talk about before?
It does, yeah. And I would say for some of my models more than others, or for some of my models, it's easier to think of them in this kind of way than others. So one of the things that I really like about some of the other models, Chris's flood model and its description, is that it kind of, like he was saying, it's sort of almost halfway there to a model land to begin with that you can imagine, because it's sort of embedded in a surface. And so I sometimes have disease models that I work on that are spatially laid out, right? So they're neighborhoods or they're cows moving around the landscape or whatever. And it's kind of easy to imagine how to transfer that into a world that you could play a game in, or you could take a quest through. Some of my models are a little bit more abstract, and then they definitely lean further into the like uncanny Lovecraftian vats of people swirling around, getting sucked from place to place, this kind of thing, which is also I think pretty fun to think about. So I think it absolutely can be a way to understand about disease models. For humans, for livestock, for plants, for anything like that. One of the things that I like about them is that despite the fact that I'm a disease modeler, I still sort of see other people's disease models and imagine them as being, perfect simulations of their like people, badgers wandering the world, dogs biting people, this sort of thing. But of course, it's not. So me thinking about my own models this way really exposes that. I think that's useful, and I think also that I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of bigger projects, how to embed this in bigger projects about models and how people understand them and what they think about them. And I think disease models are one area where we've seen that they can have a really big impact on people's lives, right? Like real things that people have to do or don't have to do, or how they understand how to keep themselves safe. And therefore, any extra tools that help us expose what is going on inside these models and helps people to understand these things that really impact on their lives is a good thing.
And Erica, given these ideas started with your book, how do you see these two approaches of the idea of escaping from model and trying to understand it's not real life, it is a sort of construct, and then these ideas of adventures in model land? How do you think those two approaches relate to each other?
Well, I think ultimately they're really complementary, because in order to escape from model land, we have to understand what it is that we're escaping from, right? So we need to understand what all the caveats are. We need to go right down into the nitty-gritty of our models and say, well, where are the default assumptions? Where are the things that have been simplified? Where are the things that are doing something a bit weird, in order to be able to escape from model land? If we don't have that view of what's actually going on, then we can't construct either mathematical or intuitive ways of understanding what the quality of that model is, and therefore transferring our insights back to the real world. So I think they're extremely closely linked, actually.
And I know you've released, Chris and Jess and Erica, I think all of you are involved in this framework that's now being shared with people, researchers, to develop their own model land, adventures in model lands. What are you hoping will happen next with that project?
Yeah, I think for me it was about putting it out there. So I just shout out to the rest of our team as well, as Sam Illingworth, Rolf Holt, and Liz Lewis, who have helped us develop this. For me, I kind of just wanted to wind it up and let it go and see where people take it. I think that it's like we've touched on, for the types of models I work on, it's quite easy to imagine a world from there. But I really want to see kind of some of the crazier places that this model land can take, and some of the different ways it can go. Recently ran a workshop at the European Geoscience Union General Assembly last couple of months ago, where we had people going through the framework with their own models. We took them through step by step, and people responded to it in different ways. So what I was trying to get them to do is to write a postcard from their model land that they've created. So we went through the world building, create a model land. But actually, quite a few of the people were like, "Oh, actually, we developed this concept for a board game based on the framework, or we're going to make this tabletop activity which follows this rule." So we want to go out there and see where people take it and get them to feedback and try and get a community going of people creating model lands and doing adventures in model lands, and then see what we can learn from it.
Jess, does your idea, you already were working with this idea of making tabletop versions of some of your models as a game. Do you see this as a sort of coming together of these ideas? And what are you thinking of doing next with Model Land?
I guess I sort of thought of it as a bit complementary to the board games side of my work, but that's because I'm a big nerd. And so to me, like, tabletop RPGs and board games are two things that are, totally big individual spheres of activity. Whereas I realize that to a normal human, those might look like the same kind of thing. So I came to this relatively recently, right? Like the framework mostly existed, I think, when I came up and found it. So I heard of this first at a meeting that I think was organized by Erica that Chris was at, giving a talk about this framework. And I was sitting there in the audience wearing my necklace of D&D dice and just immediately loved this, as you would expect. Right. And so then I started thinking about it and how I could use it in my own work. And I have a couple ways that I really am hoping that it goes forward. So one is that I want to use it for myself. I think it's fun to communicate models this way. I think especially if you work in disease modeling, a lot of what we do when it's really in action, when it's really needed, is very serious and can be pretty grim, right? Like bad things are usually happening when we're deploying big infectious disease models. And so there are ways that you should communicate about them to help people understand what's going on in those circumstances. And I think this is a really nice way, when we're not in those really dire circumstances, that we can communicate about these models in a way that is a little bit more lighthearted. Like it's a little bit more enjoyable to learn about them, and to spark that spark of mischief or fun or this kind of thing that helps, I think, people be curious and feel the weird uncanniness of it and really understand it. So I think this is a complementary way to understand epidemic models in a more enjoyable way when that's appropriate. With that in mind, I'm also hoping to engage other people in using this framework in building up an overall bigger picture of ways that we communicate things about our models. So there are some other big projects that I'm a small piece of a collaboration in, where they're trying to bring together, ideas from artificial intelligence and how models are described there, and other kinds of ways of describing what is in a model, what is it useful for, what policy related things are there about it, what are its sensitivities, how does it work, kind of just a general picture, a suite of different ways of communicating what's in those models and how they work. And I think this is another tool to add to that suite that has a really different flavor to it. For public communication.
Just to point out that the framework that we've got, it's freely available, and it's on an open source license, Creative Commons license, so you can just get it on Zenodo, I think that's how you pronounce it. So you can just download it there, and if people do make their model lands and things, please do share them with us, because we're very enthusiastic about it, and we like seeing what people come up with, and we want to share those things and encourage others to do likewise.
That was Chris Skinner, Erica Thompson and Jess Enright telling us about their adventures in Model Land. Thanks to all of them and for talking to my colleague Rachel Thomas. And special thanks to Chris for allowing us to use excerpts from his journal about his adventures in his Model Land from his Caesar Lisflat model. We'll include links to all the things mentioned in this podcast in the show notes, particularly Erica's book, Escape from Model Land, and all the adventures in Model Land resources. That's it for this podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, then please recommend us to a friend, or if you could rate and review us wherever you are listening, that will really help other people find us. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.